And suddenly he became aware, like a pool of liquid, a man's shaving gel started to bubble up on the floor of this craft, and coming out of it was one small grey being. Gary Wood said, Malcolm, I couldn't move anything, but I could see this creature coming out from the floor of this gel. He says, Malcolm, I desperately wanted to punch one of these beings, and I couldn't move a muscle, I couldn't move my arms, and I was so despondent because they have taken me out of my home and then subjected me to this form of trauma. And he says, Malcolm, I tried to understand what was going on, but I know for sure that these words coming into my head were not my own. I says, what do you mean, Gary? He says, well, I said in my head, why are you doing this to me? And he says, this is what they said. Sanctuary. And he says, Malcolm, I don't know. It blew me away. I mean, why did they say that? And then one of these small creatures said, we have lives like you too.
We have lives like you too?
Yeah. So that could mean anything. What angers me is that UFO abductions have been going on for 60, 70, 80 years or more. Why do they still require what appears to be this genetic side, sperm, the ova? They say that it's to repopulate or regenerate a dying planet. You and I know the stories that many females have been re-abducted and shown a half-human, half-alien child,
right,
telepathically saying, that also belongs to you.
What is the sanctuary?
Oh, I wish I knew. The chaps never asked any more. You know, they didn't keep it going. They didn't keep that discussion going. Whether that was on their part or these beings' part, that's all the information that they got. So I'd love to know what sanctuary was all about.
Did they have any intuitive impression that sanctuary might mean this planet? Sanctuary might mean the tubes with the resurrection technology? Did they have any intuitive sense of what sanctuary meant?
It's hard to say what that meant to them, but obviously it does mean something to them for them saying it. Something that I don't think I mentioned in my book was that several months after this incident, Gary awoke one night and he saw one of these grey beings at the foot of his bed. And this little being, face contorted in sheer surprise at being seen. And Gary, for some reason, he found control of his body, can move about freely, and he jumped out of bed. He says, Malcolm, I really wanted to give this creature some of what my frustration was all about. He says, this is what happened. I jumped out of bed. It wasn't a big punch, Malcolm. He says, I punched this one small grey being, and it was like hitting a paper mache doll or something. It just tumbled. It tumbled in somersaults, and it was hysterically funny, he said, and it just stopped, and it ran through the wall. We're still looking for answers. We're still trying to ascertain why. Why did this happen in the first place? We know about the hearsay, about genetics, but when it happens to you personally, as it has to Gary and Colin, they need strong answers because it's affected their lives.
Good story, Linda.
And George, if you have been looking at Earth Files, you can see how these images and illustrations that are woven through by Gary and Colin are really quite amazing. And in fact, there is one section that I included at Earth Files that was not in the interview, and this is where one of the men looked down. He could not get up. He was paralyzed on the table. This was Gary, and Gary Wood said that he could see that there was a girl on the floor. She looked human to him, like she had permed hair, and he could not talk. And the only interchange as a human on the table and the female human, at least as it appeared to him on the floor, was that she was shivering and had her arms clasped around her legs as if to cover her body, and that the temperature was cold, which is something that abductees note often, that the rooms that they're in are cold. And she was crying, and she turned and their eyes met. He couldn't move. He couldn't talk. And he said to Malcolm, he said, I will never forget that shaggy, loose-permed hair with blonde highlights, and if I ever saw her on Earth, I would recognize her. And I bring that up just to say that there are parallels in many other abduction cases of a human who thinks that they see other humans on craft, and that when it comes to the issue of Colin being in what was he described as like a glass cylinder, in my third book, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 2, High Strangeness, I featured 3 different people in the human abduction syndrome who all described seeing multiple clear cylinders in which there were either humans or looked human or distinctly did not look human, and that the abductee understood that they were being preserved, cloned bodies being preserved. And one example was a woman named Linda Porter from California, and she said, this was a quote, I was shown a room with very tall, clear tube-like containers or cylinders on a raised platform. Inside these tubes, standing upright, naked, and appearing to be asleep, were humans, or at least they looked human to me, like they were in some kind of suspended animation. And another abductee from New Jersey said, quote, we walked through the craft and we ended up in this humongous room with tubes. The walls were lined with these tubes. They appeared to be glass, about 2 feet wide and 8 feet high. Remember, in the abduction case in Scotland, they said maybe 10 to 12 feet high. She said 8 feet high, so these are tall. Cylinder, clear tubes wide enough to hold bodies. The huge room was filled with these clear tubes, and inside were tall and shorter humanoid bodies. Then a third abductee, this is a man from Michigan, told me, quote, these little gray things took me where there were 3 ladies inside of clear tubes. Each lady was in a different clear tube. There was some kind of dim light in the tubes. It was an eggshell white light. So beautiful, but it smelled like acid, sweet, pure vanilla, and it made me nauseous. The women in the tubes were alive, but not awake. And finally, there is the famous Betty Andreasson experience, and this also involved transparent cylinders. On January 25th, 1967, she was in South Ashburn in Massachusetts at 6:30 in the evening. Her parents were in the house, and her 7 children were in the house. So that's 10 people in a house when, all of a sudden, as Betty described, she was paralyzed. She saw that her whole family went into what looked like suspended animation in the living room. She couldn't talk. She couldn't move. And eventually, in her very long, complex abduction, she ends up being taken also by small beings to what looked like an assemblage of clear, in this case, instead of round, they were rectangular cases. And she said, she drew this, it looked as if there were samples of humans, quote, of all races and timelines. And Betty Andreasson said she understood the purpose of those non-humans that she encountered was, quote, to preserve human genes for existence elsewhere because of an impending extinction event coming to Earth, close quote. So we're back to that extinction issue again. Yeah. But I want to close out with what I think is one of the most significant quotes in this book that Malcolm Robinson has assembled from his cases in Scotland. And this is Gary Wood talking about, after all of this and hearing the word sanctuary, and we have lives like you too, coming into their heads from telepathically from these beings in this very strange abduction. This is a quote from the book. Gary also said that he knew these beings were not going to harm him. But the most vociferous statement that Gary kept saying repeatedly was, they want to come here, meaning to Earth. He continued by saying that they are not too far away at the moment and we're somewhere near Earth. Gary also stated that he is sure that there will be many more abductions occurring all over the world because, quote, these non-human beings need us. We are very important to them. They don't want to destroy us. They just need us, close quote. And in the RAF Bentwaters case that I have been doing so much work, Sergeant James Peniston says they are time travelers facing a catastrophic future and are coming back to Earth to use us like Band-Aid.
Up next with Conversations with Linda.